Peter is one of these deep thinkers that has been at the epicenter of this noisy, connected world, and has always been at the forefront in his entire career, whether it was at Apple, whether it was as the CEO of Gloss.com, whether it was the chairman of Technorati, and now in his role as CEO of the Reimagine Group. Peter spends a lot of time thinking about different trends, how they're all connected, and he really has a unique perspective of what's going on with cities. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter. So welcome, Peter. Round of applause for Peter.
Yay. Thanks, Eric. After this brief talk, Eric and I are going to have a conversation because Eric is the Executive Vice President of Economic Development in New York. And if you ask, how is it that New York is kind of reemerging as a manufacturing center, as the maker movement suddenly becomes part of the economy, Eric has been shepherding a lot of that through, and it's a fascinating story. What I want to talk about today is how the maker movement is beginning to remake our American cities. We noticed kind of a while ago that suddenly advanced manufacturing, 3D printing, this idea that we could create things and customize them was beginning to pop up in US cities as an interesting new economic factor. And so Dale Doherty, who's the kind of creator of Maker Media, asked me to go out and look at a bunch of cities a few months ago. So I kind of went out and did a tour, and what I found was that there was this really hopeful phenomenon going on. You might ask, what is a maker city? Where is new form of manufacturing happening? Well, one way to find out is here is a map that Nick Pinkston put together of cities with hardware startup meetups. And you'll see a lot of the industrial Midwest, New York, San Francisco. We showed this slide first at the MakerCon in San Mateo a few months ago. The woman who runs economic development for Los Angeles was alarmed, chagrined that she was not on the map. And she went like running back to the mayor, newly elected mayor, and said, we're not on the map. Where are our hardware startup meetups? And so now that kind of kindled activity there. Another way you could go find out is, traditionally you'd hire a bunch of economists and they go out and find out, is this a new sector? But we don't have time for that in the maker movement. We query the API. So here, from 3D Hubs, is a map of 3D printers that are networked that you can print to. They basically represent cities that have this activity of people making things and commercially selling them. So you can see it's a European company, that a lot in Europe, a lot in the US. You can drill down to the United States. You can drill down actually to our region and realize there's a lot going on here in New York. But there's also a lot going on in the United States, which is the reason that this summer President Obama convened the first White House Maker Fair. And the reason was because the White House believes if the future of jobs is interdisciplinary skills, new forms of manufacturing, how do we kindle all of that? And one of the interesting things to come out of the White House Makers Fair was a commitment of 120 cities to become maker cities. So 120 mayors actually signed this pledge that said, we're going to have mini maker fairs, we're going to kind of convene our maker spaces, we're going to do civic innovation. So this was a really interesting example of the civic infrastructure realizing that this was kind of a jewel of the future of economic development. If you ask, well, what's going on that actually is creating this? Several things are happening. People are streaming back into the cities. Of course, we're reurbanizing. But when that happens, when people come back into cities, you realize that a maker city is a jazz city, because making is about combining all sorts of ideas, materials, and code. We live at this moment where there's so much new stuff to play with that it is like jazz, and it's also what cities do. It's what happens when people densely come together in cities, and the economic analysis shows that cities get smarter as people come together. And this is not new. It's actually what happened 100 years ago. If you look at the second industrial revolution, the 1920s, when New York was kind of at its zenith with manufacturing the last time around, that's exactly when jazz happened, when creativity happened, when African Americans were flowing up from the South, when people were coming from Eastern Europe, and that's where music and jazz happened. And that same culture today, tinker culture and hacker culture and creative culture, that's the thing that's fueling this form of economic development. But don't take it from me. Take it from that great economist and urban thinker, Wynton Marsalis, who, when speaking about jazz, said the real power and innovation of jazz is that a diverse group of people come together to create improvised art and negotiate their agendas. That negotiation is the art. Jazz is about individual performance, but it demands selfless collaboration. And in many ways, that's what's going on here. People who are coming together, building things, recombining them. And you see that in how we're teaching this stuff. So I went out and I talked to Luc Dubois, who teaches at NYU Polytechnic in Brooklyn. Luc is a musician and a computer scientist, and he told me that what he's teaching his students, everything is an and. Engineering and soft circuits, fashion and sensors, art and advanced manufacturing. You kind of get this whole bouillabaisse of skills, which is what the maker movement is about, and that's very much what the future of workforce development is going to be about. And this is really one of the great things about America, because we're a fusion of so many people and of ideas. And you see that in the physical form of how advanced kind of forms of incubation are taking place here. So for example, this is Manufacture New York. It's a 40,000 square foot facility dedicated to kind of the future of what manufacturing would look like here. And if you look at them, and their mission, by the way, is to reawaken and rebuild America's fashion industry and foster the next wave of businesses. So this tells you an interesting thing about becoming a maker city. You often take what you're historically good at, that's part of your story, and you rekindle and renew it. And you can imagine, okay, it's almost an unlikely thing to bring manufacturing of fashion back to New York, but if you look at the design of this, that place looks a bit like the MIT Media Lab. People are doing research on soft circuits and technology and LEDs and smart fabrics. It looks a bit like an incubator where people are investing in new businesses. It looks a bit like manufacturing. All of that coming together in Brooklyn is kind of a blueprint for what these things look like. And if you go and you talk to entrepreneurs in New York, they will tell you that the nature of product development and manufacturing is changing to favor more local content and interactions of customers who are also creators with the supply chain. Here's my friend Nora, who runs Collabra.
Conspicuous production. So people moved on from conspicuous consumption to conspicuous production. They don't want to just purchase and consume mass-produced items. They want to have something unique, something customized. They want to see where does something come from. They want to know the origin. It's about origin and transparency. What's good about New York is that there's so many other industries that can actually subsidize you, or you can make a living and start something by the side and then grow into something bigger.
Across America, if you actually look, where is this kind of new maker manufacturing phenomena happening? One of the resources is we're reclaiming old industrial spaces, that as recently as 10 years ago looked irrelevant. A lot of these were World War II shipbuilding facilities or manufacturing facilities that lay fallow and during the 70s and 80s almost seemed ridiculous in the urban landscape. Probably the first among these in terms of scale and what it can do is the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
New York City has been working to redevelop the Brooklyn Navy Yard, bring it back to life, recreate it as a home for good-paying industrial jobs.
What I have seen in the last 10 years is just mind-boggling. A lot of local, state, and federal dollars have been poured into the Navy Yard's infrastructure to make it what it looks like today.
What you have is manufacturing the traditional sense of making things, but it's being combined with high-end design, with new technology, with art, woodworking, metalworking.
Currently, the Navy Yard has 275 businesses, and we've created about 6,400 jobs.
We're doing a project called the New Lab. We're creating spaces which will be shared by a whole series of innovative companies based around rapid prototyping, new manufacturing, and 3D printing. We're hoping just to become a catalyst that'll spawn a whole slew of different types of economic innovation.
Living in the neighborhood and seeing the Navy Yard coming alive and having job opportunities, I'm just excited.
For the city, these kinds of jobs are critical to creating stable middle-class communities.
Brooklyn is the place to be right now. It's coming up. It's coming up.
I mean, quite literally, this city and others are learning bottom up from makers on what this new form looks like. But as much as this looks like something new, kind of those of us in the tech industry often don't have that much institutional perspective or history. We kind of think like this maker movement is something new. And yet, you can see that in 1921, at the Regiment Armory in New York, there was, in fact, the first Maker Faire, America's Making Exposition. So you may wonder, why were they having a Maker Faire 100 years before Dale Doherty? And the reason is that back then, at the height of the then Second Industrial Revolution, when we had all of these people flowing into New York, we had a mirror image of many of the social problems that we have today. You had economic disparities, you had lots of immigrants coming in, and there was a difficulty with all of that. Just as we had kind of a populist change when de Blasio got elected, and in San Francisco we're seeing those same pressures, so too then. And so the solution back then was to point out that all these pluralist influences were in fact what was going to make manufacturing great and give us that stew to work from. And so this is about a 100-page book. I'll only show you two. On the left, look, Americans of Italian heritage, they make great things. Look, Americans of Yugoslavic lineage, they make great things. It was a celebration of both diversity and kind of the ability to push the economy forward that they talked about. Maker cities are also inclusive. They have a unique story to tell, and they're clearly learning. I say inclusive because the tech industry is famous for being so leveraged that it's a few people who provide a service globally. You need one Google. And so what you're finding is a lot of people feel left out, like where are the jobs for everyone else? One of the things about manufacturing and the maker movement is there is this hope, unproven, yet it looks like an interesting thing on the landscape, that local manufacturing, the idea is that you can send drawings across, people can print things, add local content, that begins to suggest things like Etsy and Kickstarter, the beginnings of a new form of economy. And you see this in cities that are reinventing themselves. Here's Pittsburgh, back when manufacturing looks like that. Pittsburgh today kind of reclaiming its manufacturing heritage, but also with incubators like Alpha Lab, which is a hardware incubator, not unlike the ones that we have here. One of the things that you find is if you actually sit still and incubate hardware in a city, the supply chain starts to grow. Venture capitalists these days, if you have a hardware startup, they will tell you one of your founders needs to go to Shenzhen, to China, to go make stuff. It's just a requirement. When you go to Shenzhen and make stuff, you probably have to make 50 or 100,000 units, which creates all this operating leverage. Because what entrepreneurs really want to do is make stuff locally. So what you're beginning to see is that stuff grow locally. In New York, we have a company called Refractory that makes PC boards here. It's the idea that you can have local manufacturing of small yields that can support you. And that's really the pivot. You begin to get that, you bring an economy in. Here's on Labor Day, Pittsburgh having an editorial in its newspaper celebrating their manufacturing spirit. And this is a global phenomenon. It's being picked up globally. This is a book by Stefano Miceli, an Italian economist, and his whole premise is Italy has historically been great at craft, great at design. How does it reinvent itself? Not in a fully artisan economy where you're doing one-offs like Geppetto, but how do you actually put Italian designers in a network? So if you have an idea, they design it and they ship stuff back to you. There's an incubator near Venice called H Farm. It might look like manufacturer New York, but with great wine and kind of beautiful kind of design and farm scenery because it's in Italy. And so this is, in fact, global. Maker cities are also picking up on a very new idea of education. You learn by doing. All of these tools are available to kids now. So it's less about book education. It's more about almost picking up that old German apprenticeship model. This is the Makership Project. The Makership Project is all about how do we combine a quick internship with more of a traditional apprenticeship, giving people the skills of a maker professional so they can get reemployed. This is an ad for the Makership Project that's basically saying they're looking for veterans and people who are disadvantaged to learn these new skills and come into the workforce. This was Ezra, who actually was unemployed, learned Arduino, learned new forms of manufacturing, and kind of entered things. And at this point, we have little deep economics to show this, but we have lots of interesting stories that are early signals. One of my favorite is this one from San Francisco when Mark Roth walked into Tech Shop. Mark was a homeless person.
My name is Mark Roth. I'm the founder of the Learning Shelter, and basically what we're trying to do is take the learning and education model into the homeless shelters and make a deep impact on homelessness. I decided to create the Learning Shelter. It's a 90-day live-in program that takes people out of the homeless shelters and then teaches them the skills that they need in order to go out and find jobs. I found a community, it's called the Maker Community, and I became a part of it, and I learned as much as I could, as fast as I could. Between 6 months and a year and a half, I went from being homeless to being able to just barely support myself to founding and running a business that's actually doing quite well. We're gonna go out and we're gonna source people who need new skills, and we're gonna bring them in and we're gonna teach them those skills. They're everything from 3D printing to making t-shirts. When they walk out of the Learning Shelter, they're gonna have the basic understanding of how to use this stuff to get a job.
This business of being a maker, though, is more about economics. There's almost a spiritual component. If you can make something, you can bring about change. Like, I've never really met an unhappy maker, because if they don't like the way the world is, they'll just 3D print it a little differently. It's this concept of agency, that you can actually take something and change it. Here's a good example. Jason Roberts lived in a suburb of Dallas. And he went to Europe, and he noticed they had streetcars. And he noticed that in his suburb, they had the streetcar tracks, but the public transit was gone. And so he said, why don't we have it here? We need to have this. And the city said, no, you live in the suburb, forget about it. And so he then, but he didn't forget about it, he formed the Oak Cliff Transit Authority. And the administration said to him, you can't form a transit authority, you're just a citizen, we're the government. And he's like, I'm a maker, I'm forming a transit authority. And then, when funding fell through for a project in Dallas, he was in line, he was organized, they'd been making plans, he got the $30 million, and, in fact, helped remake his city. I got so excited about this, back in San Francisco, I formed the San Francisco Urban Prototyping Authority. I'm a commissioner, all of you can be commissioners. But actually it was more than that, because we actually had an urban prototyping festival. So I run an arts organization in San Francisco. We partnered with the city and with real estate people. We took a part of town. It was this part of town where Hearst and Forest Cities are rebuilding a part of town. And we said, let's actually rehearse and prototype and build out what this thing would look like. Because normally in real estate, there's some planner and an architect, and they tell you the answer. Here, people came together at Autodesk and at Tech Shop, and they came up with ideas. For example, it is illegal in San Francisco to park your car in front of a hydrant. But there's no law that says you can't put a park there. So 10 miles of garden was one idea. What if we turned the stairs into musical instruments? Here was a great idea from an artist. You hold on to that thing, it takes your heart rate, it turns it into music. I thought it was clever. Mayor Menino in Boston thought it was so great, he ordered up a dozen of them as a way of getting people out to move and walk around. I think he thought maybe that was a better thing than like banning sodas in his city, but it was a way of getting people to move. We learned in our city that there were floor plates, there were like parts of the street that were very dark, and city planning said, we don't like dark. And makers and artists came together and said, well, what if we actually turn it into creative forms of light? And we use that as a way of changing things in our city. So, there are many examples of this, but the point is that actually makers can become a big part of how you create a city. San Francisco has actually made this a formal part of city planning. We have the Market Street Prototyping Festival coming up. We're redoing our two-mile main drag. And the idea is, let's break it into 5 sections. We have a company as like the team captain of each one. So Autodesk is a team captain, the Exploratorium is. There's about 10 teams that are made up of makers and creators and artists. That's the formal process by which city planning will figure things out. You can imagine what it's like for an architect or a city planner to be told their city will be crowdsourced. Their first reaction would be, oh dear God, no, which was the same reaction editors had when the bloggers showed up about 10 years ago. Now what they're learning is, well, isn't this clever? More ideas flow in, and we can actually test and rehearse our city. And this is an idea that's catching up worldwide. We did this in Singapore recently. There's the Prime Minister of Singapore coming by and looking at kind of open collaborative things. There is this idea that a maker city is a lab, that you want to open it up as a place that you can experiment on, that just as Arduino or iOS is a platform, your city should be a platform. Paris does this really well. They have 75 projects going on in the Paris Region Lab, and this is actually something in San Francisco it's very difficult for us to do, because we're actually so used to like limiting growth that actually saying open it up, reduce permitting requirements. The secret is to always say it's just a prototype, just a prototype. Let me wrap up by talking a bit about the fact that there actually is one organization worldwide that completely plays with the notion that their city is a maker city. And I'll set that up because Jane Jacobs, the great journalist, said that by its nature, the metropolis provides what otherwise could be given only by traveling, namely the strange. And it's true, when you get this diversity, and if you walk around Maker Fair, it's not all prescribed. It's like people coming up with all sorts of crazy stuff, which is what a city street should be. The greatest maker city on earth is not street legal. You shouldn't try this on the streets of Brooklyn even. And yet it's a really great example of what happens when people come together and make something out of basically nothing.
The place is an idea.
So, of course, I'm talking about Burning Man, a festival of 70,000 people in the Nevada desert that has the least government but the most freedom, just the scaffolding from which you can create all of this amazing stuff. And what we've noticed in San Francisco and in New York and many places is that people come back from Burning Man, and whether they're creating the Bay Lights, which is a big art structure, or Free Space in San Francisco, or Gray Area Foundation for the Arts, or the people at Refractory here, there's a real dialogue between people who go to a place and can practice making a city and making a city better. So as we wrap up, we have the maker movement. And why do we call it a movement? Because we have a lot to get done in both the remaking of our cities and bringing manufacturing back. If you go back in history to that second industrial revolution, we had the labor movement, and the labor movement celebrated in Labor Day. That last industrial revolution, the movement then was about labor demanding their rights from capital. I would suggest that in the maker movement today, it's more about telling capital how to get it right in this world of distributed manufacturing, networked innovation, and local values, and how, in fact, we're creating opportunities for all of us as makers and labor, and finding a way to deploy capital in a way that is actually going to regenerate our cities, which is why we have two interesting things. You know, we've got the Martin Luther King economic justice tradition and the Robert Moses tradition of just getting something done. Both of those seem to be embodied in our movement, which is why I talk about this as the Maker City. So thank you very much. And Eric, why don't you come up and join me? So,
well done, Peter.
Thank you, Eric. You know, the other day I was in Dubai. We were talking about this at a city conference in Dubai, and we're all yakking away. And the guy on my right said, well, my job is actually to make cities. I have to deploy 4 more cities for a couple million people in the next few years. And I'm thinking, boy, that guy does the real work of city making, which is why I'm glad to talk to you, because talk to me about how here in New York, at some point, when we were a finance place or a media place, something must have bubbled up on your radar that our manufacturing heritage was coming back and people were beginning to build things.
Right. Well, first of all, you're talking about making, and I just want to point out, this is my one slide. I didn't make slides the way Peter did. This is what I got for this, but in any event, your comments were great, Peter. You know, when we think about manufacturing in New York, this is an industry that has been in decline for 50 years. And if you take Edison's quote that stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, there was no different result for manufacturing, a huge legacy in New York City, but employment numbers just declined. And those sort of stabilized in 2011. And now we've been seeing growth in the manufacturing for the first time in 50 years, which is really amazing. And it's really part of all of these different changes that are going on. In terms of the advanced manufacturing focus in New York City, in 2011 we commissioned a study on rapid prototype. We realized that in many ways a lot of the innovative advanced manufacturing sector was bubbling up. It was very dispersed around the city, and the city spent a lot of time trying to, at least at the very beginning, just connect some of the makers with some of the facilities and at least provide some cohesion to that movement. And I think that's part of the reason why we've seen a lot of that develop in New York City. And that, by the way, in addition to the fact that New York City is really ripe for this type of sector. We have a lot of creative folks, we have a lot of artistic folks, we have a legacy manufacturing industry. All that with all of the business that goes on in New York has really created a very robust sector here. So,
there are a number of activities that government does, and one of them is this, which is kind of you're creating an incubation of hardware. So tell us about Next Top Maker and what's going to happen tomorrow.
Great. So tomorrow we have a Next Top Makers competition, one of the many activities that the city undertakes to help support the makers movement. And this really has been a challenge to innovators, to makers, to designers, to creators, to come up with innovative products and ideas that have commercial potential. And we've launched this competition. Tomorrow we're going to announce the six winners. We're going to do it at 3 o'clock tomorrow, so I hope you can join when we make that announcement. We also have another special announcement that we're going to make on behalf of the mayor, so I think it'll be sort of a fun time tomorrow at 3 o'clock.
So I have a question about kind of the urban form and space. So manufacturing like requires different stuff than like office space, and this current form of innovation and co-working looks very different. What are the kind of things you're doing space-wide? You know, I see the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I see, you know, you've got like boroughs where you're beginning to look at things differently. How are you working with real estate and design and all that?
Yeah, so I think in many ways we're still trying to figure out the real estate of this and sort of the physical requirements. What's interesting is that when you look throughout New York, it's really been a 5-borough phenomenon. There's been companies like Little Bits that have been created in Manhattan, companies like MakerBot that have started in Brooklyn. You've got Shapeways in Queens, so companies in Staten Island. So this has really been a very interesting 5-borough strategy, diversified across the city. But we're starting to think through, I mean, you pointed out Manufacture New York, Brooklyn Navy Yard, you know, we also have the Brooklyn Army Terminal. These are sort of buildings that were built by the federal government. The Brooklyn Army Terminal was bought by the city for $1 35, 40 years ago. And we're starting to rethink, how do we use this space, these are millions of square feet, to be able to modify them for, you know, legacy industries that need new types of you know, innovations. We're not there yet. I mean, we've certainly made great strides. What's going on at the Brooklyn Navy Yard is really interesting. There's some great companies that are doing manufacturing at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, but I still think we're in the early parts of that movement.
Where does leadership for this stuff come from? Is it the private sector and real estate? Does it come from government? Like where do you take your cues and amplify stuff?
So, you know, I think this is one of the areas where, and as a city, we have spent a lot of time focusing on what I look at as sort of public-private partnerships, but it's even more than that. It's the city with business, with academia. And many of you may know about our Applied Science Initiative, where we partner with Cornell Tech to bring and increase the number of applied science students and engineers. This is a movement that I think has come in all directions. It's come from bottom up from the community, it's come from business, it's come from the academic centers, and then it's come because the city has been a convener of bringing all of this together and connecting the universities with the businesses, with financing, and allowed those connections to, you know, happen faster.
Do you get questions from either the mayor or kind of investors? Is this thing going to scale? Will this make lots of jobs? You know, are things like Kickstarter and Etsy just going to stay at small scale, or is this going to become kind of a big part of the economy? Does that kind of stuff come up?
Yeah, you know, again, this is, you know, we spend a lot of time looking at all the numbers. You know, just in terms of numbers, the industrial sector is about 500,000 jobs in New York City. Manufacturing is about 15% of that, so it's about 75,000. You know, rich tradition of manufacturing. We spend time thinking about legacy industries and how do they innovate for the 21st century. So we certainly spend a lot of time. We don't have all the answers, and so what we try and do is, as I mentioned earlier, we try and make sure that those connections are there so that we have all of the talented people in New York thinking about it, thinking about how to create it, and then also, which is very important to the mayor, making sure that we're opening up the industry so that there's opportunity for all, you know, for all New Yorkers.
I want to wrap up with one final question, which is, in many ways, what you're doing, I think you're consciously trying to make this a template for other cities. And I know that when the new mayor was coming in, you were doing a lot of work to try to gather up what you guys are up to. How can other cities, because we had 100 and some odd cities take the Maker City Pledge, learn from what goes on here?
Well, I think the first thing is we've got to get you on the road. You've got all these great slides talking about everything that's going on in New York. You know, one of the things we do at the New York City Economic Development Corporation is we welcome a lot of groups from all around the city. In fact, quite frankly, all around the world. We're happy to share what's going on. But it really is one of these movements that's come in all these different directions. And as a city, we're trying to make sure to think through the real estate part. We're trying to think through the connections. And we're doing things to spur innovation and activity. You know, in addition to this competition, and I truly believe that in government, little things can lead to big actions, like doing these competitions. We've also opened up incubators. We have a makerspace in Staten Island. So we're doing a whole host of things to really accelerate this industry and to recognize the really talented, creative people that are creating this movement.
I have to tell you that when I first went off and looked at all these cities, when Dale asked me to look at them, I went out looking for maker cities, and I came back realizing what I had seen was the American dream, because this is such an amazing moment of reinvention. And if you look at around the world, because I'm in San Francisco a lot, people stream into here in San Francisco like, what's that secret sauce? How are you doing this innovation? What can we take back to our place? And it's a really amazing, A, example of our character, and B, other people do kind of need our help, because you see people spend hundreds of millions of dollars on industrial parks, but they haven't gotten the human and the software piece right, so there's much to share, all of which is coming from this community, because it's literally bubbling up from makers. So thank you very much, and thank you very much,
Thank
Eric.
you.